The airport was loud that evening. Rolling suitcases clicked across the shiny floor. Boarding calls echoed through the speakers, and people rushed past each other without making eye contact. Near the end of the line for boarding stood a woman, holding a small, worn duffel bag. She was not dressed in business clothes like many of the other passengers. She wore simple jeans, a plain jacket, and comfortable shoes. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her face carried a calm, unreadable expression. When her group was finally called, she stepped forward quietly and handed over her boarding pass. The agent scanned it without much interest and waved her through. Inside the plane, most of the overhead bins were already full. She moved carefully down the aisle, counting the rows until she reached her seat. C, a middle seat. She paused for a second, then gave a small nod to herself and slipped into the narrow space. The man by the window was wearing an expensive watch and tapping on a tablet. The woman on the aisle had a designer handbag resting on her lap. Both looked up briefly when she sat down. The aisle passenger glanced at her duffel bag and then at her clothes. Her smile faded. "Is this seat taken?" the woman asked, even though the boarding pass was clearly in the newcomer's hand. "Yes," she answered softly. 22C, the man by the window leaned slightly toward the aisle passenger and whispered something. They both gave small, amused smiles. The woman in the middle seat buckled her seatbelt and placed her hands calmly in her lap. She did not react. She had likely heard whispers before. She kept her eyes forward. A few minutes later, the aisle passenger pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, she spoke in a low voice, but not low enough. "I think there's been a mistake. We paid for these seats months ago." The attendant looked confused. "There's no mistake, ma'am." "It just seems odd," the passenger continued, glancing toward the woman in the middle. "Are you sure she's supposed to be here?" The flight attendant turned politely. "May I see your boarding pass?" Without complaint, the woman handed it over. Her hands were steady. The attendant checked it. "Yes, this is correct. Seat 22C. The boarding pass was returned. No apology followed. The woman simply nodded and folded the paper carefully before placing it in her jacket pocket. As the plane began to taxi, the whispers started again. "Unbelievable," the aisle passenger muttered. "Probably upgraded at the last second," the man replied quietly. "Or maybe some kind of discount." The woman in 22C stared ahead. Outside the window, runway lights blinked in the growing darkness. Her expression did not change, but her eyes seemed distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. When the plane lifted into the air, the cabin lights dimmed. Conversations quieted. The steady hum of the engines filled the space. About 30 minutes into the flight, mild turbulence shook the aircraft. A few passengers gasped. The man by the window gripped his armrest. The aisle passenger let out a nervous laugh. The woman in the middle seat did not move. Her breathing remained slow and even. The turbulence passed, but something else began to shift. Up in the cockpit, a soft, alert tone sounded. The captain frowned at the screen in front of him. A message had come through a secure channel. 1. Not typically used during routine commercial flights. He read it once. Then again. The first officer looked over. "What is it?" The captain didn't answer immediately. He checked the passenger manifest on his tablet. His finger scrolled down the list, stopping at a name in row 22, seat 22C. He leaned back slowly, processing what he was seeing. Back in the cabin, the woman adjusted her jacket slightly. For the first time since boarding, she closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but as if listening for something far away. A moment later, the seatbelt sign turned on again, and the captain stood up from his seat. The captain did not usually leave the cockpit during a flight unless there was a serious issue. The first officer looked at him carefully. "You're going out there?" he asked. The captain nodded. "Keep us steady." He stepped out of the cockpit and closed the door gently behind him. The flight attendant standing near the front galley looked surprised. "Is everything all right?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes," he said calmly. "I just need to confirm something." Passengers noticed him walking down the aisle. A few people straightened in their seats. It wasn't normal to see the captain outside like this. When he reached row 22, he stopped beside the middle seat. The woman looked up at him, her expression steady. For a second, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The captain spoke quietly but clearly. He did not use her civilian name. Instead, he said a single word. A call sign. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried weight. The woman's eyes changed slightly when she heard it. Not shock, not fear, just recognition. "Yes," she replied in a calm voice. The aisle. Passenger looked confused. "What is going on?" The captain ignored the question. He held the woman's gaze for a moment longer. "Thank you for confirming," he said respectfully. He gave a small nod. Not casual, not friendly, but formal. Then, he turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Whispers started immediately. What was that about? Did he just call her something? Was that some kind of code? The woman in 22C adjusted her seatbelt and looked straight ahead again. She did not smile. She did not explain. The man by the window leaned slightly away from her now. His earlier confidence had faded. Up in the cockpit, the captain closed the door and sat down quickly. "It's her," he said. The first officer raised his eyebrows. "You're sure?" She confirmed the call sign. A moment later, another secure message came through. Short, direct, escort authorized. The first officer stared at the screen. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." Within minutes, air traffic control cleared their flight path. Other planes were directed slightly off course. The cabin crew was told to remain calm and continue normal service. Down below, passengers began noticing something outside the windows. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance. Then it became clear. A gray fighter jet was flying alongside them. Someone gasped loudly. Oh my God. Phones came out quickly. People leaned across each other to get a better look. "There's another one," someone shouted from across the aisle. On the other side of the plane, a second jet matched their speed perfectly. The sight was unreal. The powerful aircraft flew smoothly, close enough to be clearly visible but far enough to remain professional. The aisle passenger in 22C grabbed the armrest. "Why are military jets next to us?" No one answered. The woman in the middle seat remained calm. She glanced briefly toward the window but did not seem surprised. The flight attendant hurried down the aisle, trying to keep people seated. "Please, remain calm," she said gently. "Everything is under control." Under control. That phrase echoed in the cabin. The man by the window slowly turned toward the woman in 22C. "You knew about this?" he asked quietly. She looked at him for the first time since boarding. "No," she said simply, "but I understand it." Her voice was steady, almost reassuring. In the cockpit, the captain received one final message. Priority landing granted. Continue current heading. He exhaled slowly. Back in row 22, the atmosphere had completely changed. The same passengers who had whispered about her clothes and bag were now staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. The aisle passenger swallowed hard. "Are we in danger?" The woman shook her head gently. "No. You're safe." Those two words carried more confidence than any announcement. Outside, the fighter jets held their formation as the commercial aircraft continued toward Washington. Inside, silence slowly replaced the earlier judgment. And for the first time since, she had taken her seat. No one in 22C questioned whether she belonged there. The two fighter jets stayed beside the plane as if they had always been there. They moved smoothly through the sky, steady and controlled. The sight was both beautiful and frightening. Passengers could not look away. Inside the cabin, the earlier whispers were gone. No one was laughing now. No one was making comments about seat numbers or clothing. The only sounds were the engines and the quiet clicks of phone cameras. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been granted priority clearance for landing in Washington. There is no cause for concern. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." He did not explain the jets. He did not mention any names. But everyone knew something important was happening. The woman in 22C sat with her hands folded again, just as she had when she boarded. She did not seem nervous. She did not seem proud. She simply looked forward, as if she had been in situations like this before. The aisle passenger cleared her throat quietly. I'm sorry if we were rude earlier," she said, her voice softer than before. The woman turned her head slightly. Her expression was not angry. "It's all right," she replied. "You didn't know." The words were simple. There was no sarcasm in them. That made it heavier somehow. The man by the window leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Are you military?" She paused for a moment before answering. "I used to serve," she said. That was all. But the way she said it carried more meaning than a long speech ever could. A flight attendant approached their row slowly. This time her posture was different. There was respect in her eyes. "Ma'am," she said gently, "if you would like, we can move you to first class for the remainder of the flight." The offer hung in the air. The woman looked around the cabin. Dozens of eyes were on her now, not judging, not mocking, just watching. She gave a small shake of her head. "No, thank you. This seat is fine." The flight attendant nodded. "Of course." As she walked away, the aisle passenger stared at the middle seat, almost as if trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly. Outside, the lights of Washington began to appear in the distance. The jets adjusted their position, slightly, guiding the plane forward. Another announcement came from the cockpit. "We'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seats are upright and tray tables are secured." The tone was professional, but there was something different beneath it, something more careful. The plane began its descent. The city lights grew brighter, closer. A young boy across the aisle leaned over his seat and whispered loudly, "Mom, is she a hero?" His mother quickly hushed him, embarrassed. But the woman in 22C heard him. She glanced over and gave the child a small, warm smile. "No," she said gently. "I just did my job." The plane touched down smoothly. As the wheels met the runway, a strange feeling settled over the cabin. Relief, yes, but also curiosity. Instead of taxiing toward the busy terminal gates, the aircraft turned toward a quieter part of the airfield. Passengers noticed black vehicles parked in the distance. The aisle passenger's fingers tightened around her handbag again. "This is about you, isn't it?" she whispered. The woman did not answer right away. She looked out the window at the dark runway, at the flashing lights, at the escorting jets peeling away into the night sky. Then she spoke softly. "Not just me." The engines powered down slowly as the plane came to a complete stop in a remote area. Outside, uniformed personnel were already approaching. Inside the cabin, every single person sat silently, waiting. And in seat 22C, the woman unbuckled her seatbelt, calm, steady, and ready for whatever came next. The engines went quiet, but no one stood up. No one reached for the overhead bins. The cabin felt frozen in place. Through the small windows, passengers could see several black vehicles parked near the plane. A few uniformed officers stood waiting at the bottom of the mobile stairs that had been rolled into position. The door at the front of the aircraft opened slowly. Two security officers stepped inside first. They scanned the cabin calmly, not in a threatening way, but with purpose. Behind them, an Air Force officer in dress uniform entered. His posture was straight, his expression serious. Every head turned. The officer spoke quietly to the flight attendant, then walked down the aisle. The sound of his shoes against the floor seemed louder than it should have been. When he reached row 22, he stopped. He stood directly beside the middle seat. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other. Then the officer lifted his hand in a precise salute. The entire cabin went completely silent. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, addressing her by the same call sign the captain had used earlier. "Thank you for your service. We appreciate your cooperation." She returned the salute gently, her movement calm and practiced. "It's good to see you again," she replied in an even tone. The aisle passenger stared in disbelief. The man by the window sat perfectly still, as if afraid to breathe too loudly. The officer continued, his voice low but clear enough for nearby rows to hear. "We received confirmation that your presence on this flight required precautionary escort due to tomorrow's scheduled briefing." He did not share details. He did not explain further. But the word briefing carried weight. The woman nodded slightly. "Understood. We'll escort you safely to your vehicle," he said. There was no drama, no flashing lights inside the cabin. Just quiet respect. The flight attendant stepped closer, looking almost emotional. "Ma'am," she said softly, "on behalf of the crew, thank you." The woman gave her a small smile. "You did your job well." The officer stepped aside to allow her space. She reached up calmly, pulled down her worn duffel bag from the overhead bin, and adjusted the strap over her shoulder. As she stood in the aisle, passengers instinctively moved their legs aside. Not out of fear, but out of respect. The aisle passenger looked up at her, eyes filled with regret. "I'm truly sorry," she whispered. "We shouldn't have judged you." The woman paused for a second. "It happens," she said gently. "Just remember this moment next time." There was no anger in her voice, just quiet truth. She stepped forward, walking down the aisle without rushing. People watched her pass, some lowering their eyes, others nodding slightly as she moved by. Near the front of the cabin, a young flight attendant stood with her hands clasped. "Thank you for protecting us," she said, barely above a whisper. The woman stopped briefly. "It was never about recognition," she replied. "It was about responsibility." Then she continued toward the open door. Outside, the night air was cool. The runway lights stretched across the dark field. The black vehicles waited patiently. As she stepped onto the mobile stairs, the Air Force officer followed one step behind her. At the bottom, two more officers stood at attention. She did not look back at the plane. Inside the cabin, passengers remained seated, watching through the windows as she was escorted to one of the waiting vehicles. No one spoke until the door closed behind her. Only then did the cabin slowly fill with hushed conversation. "Who is she? What did she do? I can't believe we were sitting next to her." The man by the window stared at the empty middle seat. Just an hour ago, it had been just seat 22C. Now it felt like the most important seat on the plane, and somewhere beyond the runway lights, the woman who had been humiliated only hours earlier was already on her way to something far or bigger than anyone in that cabin could imagine. The plane remained parked on the quiet side of the runway for several more minutes after she left. Inside the cabin, people slowly began to process what they had just witnessed. The earlier tension had turned into something else. Reflection. Eventually, the captain's voice returned over the speaker. "Thank you for your patience. We will now proceed to the terminal. Please remain seated." His tone was steady, but there was a hint of pride in it. As the aircraft began to taxi again, passengers started talking in low voices. Phones were already buzzing with messages. Some had recorded the fighter jets outside the windows. Others had captured the moment when the officer saluted her. The aisle passenger in row 22 looked down at her hands. "I can't believe how we acted," she said quietly. The man by the window nodded. We thought we knew everything about her in 5 seconds. Neither of them spoke after that. When the plane finally reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, people stood up more slowly than usual. No one rushed the aisle. The mood had changed. As passengers exited, several glanced once more at seat 22C. It looked ordinary again, just another middle seat, but it no longer felt small. By the next morning, short clips of the Escort were already circulating online. News outlets began reporting that a commercial flight had received a rare military escort due to security precautions connected to a former Air Force officer. Details were limited. Names were not released. Speculation grew quickly. Comment sections filled with theories. Some called her a hero. Others simply expressed gratitude. Meanwhile, in a secure building in Washington, she walked through metal detectors and into a private briefing room. There were no cameras there. No applause. Just serious faces and quiet conversations. She listened, more than she spoke. The briefing concerned national safety, aviation protocols, and information only a handful of people were trusted to handle. Her experience from years of service gave her a perspective few others had. When the meeting ended, one senior official thanked her personally. "We appreciate you coming forward," he said. She nodded. "If it keeps people safe, it's worth it." Later that evening, she stepped outside into the cool air of the city. No escort this time, no attention, just traffic sounds and distant lights. She checked her phone. There were a few missed calls from old friends who had seen the news, and somehow guessed it was her. She smiled softly, but didn't return the calls right away. Instead, she sat on a quiet bench for a moment. Her mind drifted back to the plane, to the whispers, the doubt, the way people had looked at her when she first took her seat. She didn't feel angry about it. She understood something most people didn't. Fear and judgment often come from not knowing. Later, she boarded a simple evening flight back home. No escort, no special treatment, just another boarding pass and another assigned seat. This time, no one questioned her. A young woman sitting next to her offered a polite smile. "Long day?" the stranger asked. She nodded lightly. "Something like that." The plane lifted into the night sky. She closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace. She had never worn her accomplishments on her sleeve. She had never asked for recognition. The call sign that once echoed through military channels meant something powerful, but it was not who she was. She was someone who had served, someone who had protected, someone who had chosen responsibility over attention. Back in row 22 on the earlier flight, 2 passengers would remember that lesson for the rest of their lives, and somewhere above the clouds, flying quietly home, the woman who once sat in seat 22C proved something simple and unforgettable. You never truly know who is sitting beside you, and sometimes the quietest person carries the strongest story.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.